Wow, did we ever get a lot of questions about the Lost Squadron and Carbon-14 and dinosaur bones. Several people doubled and tripled questions within one comment or email, so let me break them up. Excellent show, easy to understand, fact-filled, well-documented, and fast-paced for the modern soundbite generation. I got to see Glacier Girl at the Oshkosh EAA a few years ago, and at first I didn't even realize it was one of the planes that sunk in Greenland. The next day I got some photos of it. Also, can you tell me how many seasonal rings were above the P-38 and why the plane could not have sunk into a crevasse? Was the plane crash in the same place as where the ice cores were taken, or is the snowfall the same all over Greenland? If the ice layers in your photographs were 2 meters thick, then the cores must have been more than 10 meters across. Is that the normal size of ice cores? May I please see your sources on the frozen aircrafts? I would to see the report or any evidence of that plane story, since you do not cite everything you say or post it as a reference in your description. For those of you who missed that episode of Genesis Week, I was pointing to the Lost Squadron of World War II aircraft, which had to ditch on the Greenland Glacier in 1942, and one P-38 was recovered in 1992 from underneath over 250 feet of ice that had accumulated on top of the aircraft in 50 years. The P-38 that was recovered was named Glacier Girl. Now, a quick Google search for Glacier Girl or Lost Squadron reveals that there is no lack of reading and viewing material. The entire story was documented in the book The Lost Squadron and on a National Geographic DVD made for the History Channel called Hunt for the Lost Squadron. Now, remember that the expedition was a historic one and not scientific. They were retrieving aircraft, not studying ice cores. There is no formal scientific write-up that I'm aware of, but the facts are clear, and you can view photographs and video for yourself and see the hundreds of ice layers visible in the gopher hole. So the point I was making was that this clearly shows that the assumptions of the ice layers, representing tens of thousands of years, is falsified. But let's answer the specific questions and then take things a step farther to drive the point home. The glacier and planes had drifted several miles from their original location, though the planes were found in the same configuration in which they had been left. We know that the planes could not have sunk into the ice or fallen into a crevasse, because in either case, the plane would be oriented differently. If you drop a plane in the air, it will fall nose down. It's the same principle in ice or water. Now, as for whether or not the snowfall was different at that location than where the Greenland ice cores were drilled, if you think about it, it's irrelevant. The assumption that an ice layer represents a year of accumulation has been clearly falsified. For those of you who missed the previous show, the Greenland ice cores are samples taken from the huge glacier on Greenland, which is up to 10,000 feet thick. They get these samples by drilling a cylinder into the ice and then pulling out the core sample. Now, I'm not entirely sure how the one viewer was confused by the size of the cores. This may be because in my slide I had one core shown vertically with the other shown horizontally. But nevertheless, you can see in this photo here that the cores are typically only a few inches across. The ice is composed of layers which were interpreted by various means to represent years, typically one layer per year. And the research team has claimed an alleged ice history of over 100,000 years. Obviously a problem for the biblical timescale of 6,000 years. Now, as you can see by the photos from the excavations of the Lost Squadron, there were hundreds of layers that formed in 50 years. Layers of ice can be formed in multiple ways, sometimes in a single day. But there's more to the Greenland ice core interpretation than just counting the layers. The layers are interpreted using other methods such as oxygen isotope, volcanic dust, etc., based on the assumption of deep time. So the circularity begins to come around. They assume the layers represent tens to hundreds of thousands of years. They then interpret the layers as representing tens to hundreds of thousands of years. They then show this as proof of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. Now, as far as volcanoes, there are typically 20 to 30 explosive volcanic eruptions per year. We only have a few hundred years of documented eruption history. So now you want to take volcanic ash in amongst the ice core layers, try to match the ash in a specific layer with a specific volcanic eruption when you have between 20 and 30,000 eruptions every 1,000 years? This is just plain not feasible, let alone reliable. But yet when we head on over to northern Siberia, at the same latitudes from which the Greenland ice cores were retrieved, we find the partial frozen carcasses of numerous animals like the mammoths. The mammoths alone were estimated to number in the millions in Siberia. And whenever we see modern reconstructions of mammoths, they're always portrayed as living in snowy, icy conditions, which is flat out impossible for multiple reasons. Using figures from the modern elephant, the mammoths probably needed upwards around 250 kilograms of food and 150 liters of water per day. Now, if they're munching snow for water, they have to melt that snow, which consumes body heat and energy, which they would have to make up for by eating more food. Where would they find all this required vegetation during snowy times? Consider that Siberia today gets down to minus 20 to minus 50 degrees Celsius each and every long winter. Now, the summer growing season really doesn't start until about mid-July. That coat of fur the mammoths have, they don't have oil glands that you and I have, and thus their hair would actually absorb water and further rob the mammoth of needed body heat. But it's not just the mammoths that are found there. There's horses, camels, rhinoceros, lions, leopards, bears, tigers, reindeer, the giant beaver, musk sheep, musk ox, donkeys, and a whack of other animals that nobody is claiming lived in Arctic conditions. In fact, Mike Ord spelled it out nicely with one sentence. The only similar diversity of animals is on the Serengeti of East Africa. There is every reason to conclude that the time these mammals lived in Siberia, it was considerably warmer than it is now. Please also note that the mammoths were found at the same latitudes and sometimes farther north than the Greenland ice cores. Notice that Vartanian et al. Carbon-14 dated mammoth remains on Wrangel Island from 4,000 years ago to 7,400 years ago. Several mammoths are closer to the North Pole than the grip and end grip cores were, which have ice alleged to go back over 100,000 years. Now wait a minute. Are you going to claim that 4,000 years ago it was so warm for thousands of years in the extreme north, so warm that it had diversity of animals similar to the Serengeti of East Africa, yet somehow the glacier at Greenland did not melt? Remember, I'm using the information provided by those who assume deep time. Using their numbers, it's pretty clear that Greenland would not have had an ice sheet at all a mere 4,000 years ago. And thus, the Greenland ice cores do not represent 100,000 years. So, to summarize it all, the evidence actually matches a recent ice age of the last 4,000 years, which fits in quite well with the biblical account, and the assumption that the ice age started shortly after the worldwide flood of Noah. Whereas, even force-fitting the evidence does not support the interpretation of deep time. You can read more about the ice core interpretations in several articles and papers here.